and introduce our panel. So for everyone that doesn't know, I'm Suresh Aman and the founder of the Sustainable Alpine Tourism Initiative. So I set up SATI as a result of my Cambridge University research into really looking at circular economy and the application across multiple industries, including finance, but also alpine tourism. And in doing so, I really found that actually we needed a dialogue that brought different stakeholders together, which is why I formed SATI. For those of you that don't know, it was originally planned as a physical event, but as with many things this year, the coronavirus has slightly changed that, but now it's meant that we can all meet digitally, which is great. In terms of the background behind this particular session, so SATI is really a series of events and collaborations that bring together different experts across industries, because for me, really looking at this, to embed sustainability in the ecosystem of alpine tourism actually meant to embed it in the economy, because in many places, the tourism is the economy. And I think in infrastructure more than anything, it really shows that there's many things we can do to accelerate sustainability and in particular decarbonisation. So we've got a fantastic collection of speakers joining us today, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panellists. Just in terms of how the session works today, if you could all remain on mute throughout the session, and there'll be an opportunity to ask questions via the chat function in the Q&A. I also sent you all an email with a QR code reader that you could download, because for this session, I really want you to be as interactive as possible. Just like a physical event, you would have met the speakers in person, you really would have engaged with them. And for this, I've basically done a QR code for every speaker. I encourage you to really share, to connect with each other. The hashtag for today's event is hashtag SATI Digital. Please do tag the events channels and definitely connect with the speakers, because for me, it's really important that we get knowledge sharing across different sectors and also across different specialisms. Great. So I'm just going to introduce our panel. So we have Alois Fürstaller, who is the CEO of Energieautonom, which is a large solar energy company in Austria. And just for people's background, Alois was really collaborating with me back in 2018 when I first had this crazy idea to put SATI together. So he's really been at the forefront of driving that agenda locally. We also have Constance Chalchat, who is the head of company engagement for BNP Paribas Corporate and Institutional Banking. I've worked very closely with Constance for many years, and she's really at the forefront of how to embed sustainable finance into multiple different industries, and particularly for this session, a real expert on energy efficiency and how the finance sector can support that transition. We've also got Nikolai, Jacobi, who I met through my research because he was looking at circular economy in the built environment. And he's a sustainability expert at ICLEI, which is the local government for sustainability initiative. We've also got Markus Pfeifer, who is head of process engineering at TechnoAlpin. And TechnoAlpin is one of the premier kind of snowmaking companies throughout Europe. They've also invested heavily in research and development and in big data and looking at technological drivers. So he's going to be talking a bit about. And your facilitators for today's session will be Marc, who is my colleague from Cambridge and who is also a real expert in the infrastructure space and works in that in the US. And then you also have Kelly Coombes, who is has a background in insurance and sustainability, but is now a consultant on climate risk. And she'll be facilitating part of the session as well. So the way that it's going to work, we're going to have a hopefully very engaging panel discussion, then a 15-minute Q&A, which will take us up to the hour of 2 o'clock Central European time, and then we'll go into breakout rooms. And the purpose of those is really to get you interacting together and sharing some of the ideas that you have. And those will be facilitated by myself, Marc and Kelly. So I'm just going to start with Alois, first of all. So Alois, thank you so much for joining us today. I think it's great to have you here and connecting all over the world. I think we've got people joining from lots of countries across Europe, also from the US, also some people joining from Asia as well. So thank you all for joining today. So Alois, as an expert in solar energy and someone who works with multiple corporates and also individuals and households, what role do you think solar energy has to be an enabler of the transition, specifically in alpine regions, all the way from the small hotel, the residential home, all the way to a commercial building? Do you see it being a viable technology for decarbonisation, and what's your experience in that space?
I think solar energy is a very important technology for fighting climate change. The most important thing is transparency and cost effectiveness. We are especially in mountain regions, we have a high amount of solar energy that we can use for producing electricity because on the height and the good air and all that stuff. And this cost factor is very important, but it's even more important to show the people transparency. I printed out an example to make this understandable for everybody. If somebody is buying a solar system, normally you got a system to get information about the consumption of energy at that place. And the moment the people know about their energy consumption, they can work on reducing the energy consumption. This is the first aspect. The second aspect, they know exactly how much more energy do they need on this specific place. And then they're able to add, I don't know, water power or sustainable energy power, sustainable electric power from the grid. But it's very important that the people, and this starts at the small houses and goes up to the big companies that producing skis or anything like that. The moment they know about their energy consumption, they are really able to change something on that. And so for me, the most important things are transparency and cost effectiveness. A big example is we have one hotel where the PV array is providing a cost saving of 20,500 euros a year. And before they were building up this PV array, they didn't even knew that they investing so much money in energy. It was something given by God that they have to pay this bill. And at the moment they got this PV array and they got that monitoring system on it, they start to think about how can we change our behavior, how can we change the behavior of our guests, how can we change the behavior of our workers, and so on and so forth. And that's how we are able to, first of all, save energy, and second of all, provide sustainable energy, non-fossil energy. And this is why I think solar energy is a very big enabler, because it's usable for a lot of people, different people. It can be decentralized, and so we can provide the system for a small house. Like I've printed out the graph. This is for a small house, how it looks like. The red one is the stuff they are buying. Green and blue is the consumption and the production. And you can see up there what is possible. We can do 60%, 90%. We can provide 90% of the energy needed on that place with solar for small houses. But for a hotel, we can only do 10 or 20 or 30%. And so
it's a real spectrum, I guess, in terms of the possibility of solar.
You can scale up, and I guess the more people would use systems like this, the more people would start to think about how they use energy, when they use energy. And this is a possibility to reduce the amount of energy, first of all, and second of all, giving the people a chance to produce it by themselves, because solar is a decentralizing technology. And then we are very, very short to that circular economy stuff. This is one of the most important things I see, because using or providing your own energy is nothing else than a very small economic circle for me.
And I guess that's a really interesting point you raise about the transparency of where resources are being used, and in particular energy use. I know that in my own research, a lot of the hotels that I spoke to are really engaged on this about understanding their energy use, because then they could manage it more effectively. But I think there was a real myth around some of the cost perceptions in particular about the viability of renewables. And I think we'll be tackling that a little bit later as well. So this takes me quite nicely onto Markus from TechnoAlpin, because I know, Markus, in terms of that real deep understanding of where energy is being used and really using technology to understand that, I think the work that you're doing at TechnoAlpin is quite interesting in that space, because I think you really do look at how to invest in R&D to ensure that you have, for example, efficient use of snow cannons and ensure that you're optimizing the energy used and have real visibility on that through your data systems. So are you able to go into a little bit more detail about why sustainability is important in the snowmaking process and what you're doing in respect of that? I know that for most of our audience joining today, they might not have heard of how sustainability impacts snowmaking and what organizations are doing in that space. But could you explain a bit about that? And I know aside from the energy discussion alone, you also look at the biodiversity space here. So it'd be great if you could explain a bit about that to our audience today and share your thoughts on this.
Yes, hello from my side, from Italy, from Bolzano, from the very nice South Tyrol. We are in middle of the mountains, and TechnoAlpin, it's a company. We are now 30 years on the market, and for us, still from the beginning, from the company, was always very, very important that the snowmaking system, what we are making, are completely integrated in the ski area and in the nature. Because for us, it's very important because the customers, they are making their business with the nature. And for that, the snowmaking system has to be integrated like for the customer that it is quite nice that they see the snowmaking system. That's important that they see the snowmaking system too. But if you look on the lakes, so the lakes that we are building up there to store the water we need for the snowmaking system, of course. And then we are trying always together with the customer, together with the people who owns the terrain where the lake are built, that we find a position that the position of the lake it's quite good for the energy efficiency. It means that the lake, as much as possible, the lake are up as less energy I need to pump the water.
Okay.
And for that, we are looking that the lakes are staying more on the height. And another thing about the lake, how they are built. So the lakes, they has to be built integrate in the nature, that they can be usable in the summertime for some attraction for the tourists too. That it's not only using for the winter, but they are using for the summer too. Then another very, very important thing is to understand that the water, what we are using for snowmaking, we are using the water for the snowmaking. We are not make a consumption of the water, because we just transform the water from water into snow and store then the water on the slopes in form of the snow. And then in the spring, if the snow starts to melt, we give back the water to the nature. Another thing about technologies, let's talk about technology. On the beginning, we were starting because you still need compressed air for the snowmaking system. Without compressed air, it's not working. And then on the beginning of the 90s on the market, there was only the oil compressors. And so we put the oil compressors, but we see that this was not the future, because an oil can break and then you have the oil in the nature, and this is something what we don't want to have. And then we was the first in the 99, we start with a completely oil-free compressor on the snow guns. This means for us, it's important that the nature and all the material what we are using to build the snowmaking systems are, let's say, we are not bringing in chemicals. We are using just cast iron pipes. We are using just standard steel, and we are using just concrete, and that's it. And for the snow making themselves, there is nothing else as using water and using air. And electricity, of course. The story of electricity, it's always a big story, because they were thinking, oh yeah, you're losing a lot of energy, you're using a lot of energy, but finally that's not true, because the snowmaking system, it's only working about 300 hours per year. And if you make 300 hours per year, so finally we are using less energy as you can compare it with a swimming pool. So with a swimming pool, if you make the calculation by a person, so a swimming pool is using more energy as we are using for the snowmaking system. If you calculate year per day on the slopes.
And I think that measurement aspect can transcend to many multiple sectors and industries as well. I've worked in finance now for close to 6-7 years. and transition from being an economist to now working really closely on sustainable finance engagement and communication. And I think that measurability and understanding where you have an impact in terms of climate risk and also opportunity to reduce your impact through managing those resources is really important. And that takes me really nicely onto Constance. So I guess, Constance, it's been a really fascinating journey from my side throughout this project in particular, because I think many of the sectors and companies I engaged with weren't necessarily aware of the role of sustainable finance in the transition journey. And I think, especially if you look at the infrastructure sector, I think that's one where there's a real role for engaging on decarbonisation through engaging on finance as well. And I think, although it might start with a corporate strategy from a company side, I think there's a real symbiotic relationship forming in the infrastructure sector between finance and also decarbonisation. So for most of our audience, they might not be of where that could actually lead and what the importance is. So I wondered, what are your thoughts on that? And just for people to know, as well as being a sustainable finance pro, Constance was also a pro skier as well. So I think there's a real close connection with this topic from her side.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's very close to my heart. My family was born in the Alps. My mother lives there, so it's something which is very important for me. So yeah, I think as rightly pointed out, infrastructures today, especially in the Alps, are aging. Most of the ski resorts were built in the 60s, in the 70s. Today, I see them being very low in cash. Why? Because there's less skiers, because of uneven seasons, limited snow in some seasons. We have had less and less skiers coming to the resorts. We have shorter seasons. And there's already quite a lot to invest in to prepare the transition. So we're seeing lots of ski resorts equipping themselves with things that are non-ski, non-snow related activities and infrastructure to be able to stretch their season and appeal to tourism in summertime. So basically today, there's very little cash to finance decarbonization of existing infrastructure. On the financial side, what I see is on a very high appetite to support and accelerate decarbonization. We see a vast majority of investors applying ESG filters. We have seen this year massive inflows throughout the year into sustainable investments, and especially we see a very strong appetite to invest in anything that supports both local economies and the environment. So for me, the role of sustainable finance is to channel this purposeful capital, a capital investors that wants to have an impact, to where it is the most needed and where they know it will have a truly positive impact. And that's where what you are referring to, Sarisha, the indicators, the transparency is very important. For me, the name of the game for the Alpine sector is to be able to, in a very transparent and compelling manner, talk about the quantified objectives they have when it comes to the environment and the support to the local economy. And I heard, Markus, you were talking about less energy, no polluting chemicals. I think those are very important matters. Alois as well, you were truly talking about indicators, what gets measured, gets managed. I think for me, this is one of the way you can really appeal to sustainable finance. We also need, because the world of finance tends to look at big tickets because it's just easier to invest in. So there's probably a way for sustainable finance to help in assembling many smaller investments into an investment vehicle, which is extremely appealing, but which can then be distributed across the sector, across the region, to support the economy and support decarbonization.
That's really interesting in terms of that notion of kind of local projects and scale ups as well. And I think that's where I think the policy making discussion's quite interesting to bring into that, because I think if you look at the EU Green Deal and also the circular economy package, there's a lot of discussion around how you can engage on local projects, which then become scaled up from the infrastructure side, X on the finance side. So I think seeing those two come together is really interesting. And I'd like to bring Nikolai in on that front, actually. Just a reminder for everybody, if you have questions, do please submit them via the chat function, and we'll be addressing those towards the end. But do keep them coming in, and then I'll collect them towards the end, and we'll pitch those to the speakers. So Nikolai, I know that you've done a very holistic range of different research across your career, and I came across your work looking at circular economy of waste flows in buildings. You did some excellent mapping on where circular waste flows go and how that can be supported through local infrastructure, actually. So I wondered, I know at the moment you're looking at the European Declaration of Circular Cities. I don't know if many of the people on this call would have heard of that, but I think it's a really interesting discussion around circular economy in the built environment. So I wondered, how do you think that cities agenda and in particular circular cities and some of the work that's going on there can influence the agenda in Alpine regions? And I know you yourself are an avid skier and mountaineer, so it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that, and just a bit more about this Declaration of Circular Cities, because I know that's quite a new development from an EU policy perspective as well.
Yeah, thank you, Sarisha, for the invite, for the opportunity to be here, and for the organization of this great panel and this great event. So, because you brought up the Circular Cities Declaration, well, this is a governance instrument that is a joint activity between many partners, in fact, with ICLEI being in the lead here, but between the OECD, between the European Investment Bank, Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and many more, as well as some cities around Europe, with the aim to get as many signatories, local governments at the local level, to sign off on 10 commitments based on a vision for circularity, a vision for what a circular city is, what circularity means at the local level. That is based around, I can maybe elaborate on this later on a bit more. It was launched last week at the Mannheim conference. I don't know if some of you were actually aware of that. It's a big conference on local governments and sustainability. And the declaration has around now 28 founding signatories. So it's really a sort of a governance, a political instrument for the moment. However, there may be, of course, a number of implementation support aspects that may be developed subsequently for this. Well, when talking about levers, you know, at the local level for circular economy, I think you mentioned buildings. Of course, buildings is a very very important aspect. Maybe I would. The circular economy, the claims of the circular economy when it comes to environmental claims can only really be realized when we have a decarbonized energy system. So I think at the European level, the energy transition agenda, the circular economy agenda, all these policy areas are really very much intertwined and cannot really work without each other. And when you speak about buildings, of course, you have the energy part, but I think more than 50% of an average building is of the carbon emissions of an average building stem from the so-called embodied carbon emissions, which are related
like the materials in the building itself.
Exactly. So here you have obviously a very close link. I think for the Alpine sector also, when you speak about industrial symbiosis as a key word, kind of linking to what Alois said at the beginning. I think hydrogen production is really also a key element, especially for the Alpine region, for fueling lifts and maybe even snowmaking machines. I'm not sure, Markus, but and that can be done from excess renewable energy. It's also something that can be done very locally, and making links here with different sectors.
And I think I'm really excited about that diversity of technology opportunities that are available. I know that when I started this project, I was in discussions with a couple of waste management companies as well to see, okay, how can you reuse the waste from the food sector in hotels in a whole region and turn that into biochar, which is a carbon sequestering fertilizer? And how can you then put that back into the same farming system? So you get real closing of local loops. On the hydrogen, you mentioned that's really interesting, actually. I think on the truck side, there was talk of whether that could be scaled up for the same waste management supply chain, and similarly on looking at other technologies. I think there's a real potential there for growth of innovation and technology, which will then influence the agenda even further. And definitely do reach out if you're looking at any of the discussion ideas around that, because we've really tried to map out through SATI some of those loops closing and how that's possible. And so it's great to hear you talking about that as well, Nikolai. Just moving over to Alois now, I think you obviously are quite a sustainability leader in that region of Zelensee and Texenbach and Salzburgland. I know we've worked together quite closely for a few years now, actually, on this project in particular. So I wondered, beyond the energy discussion alone, what role do you see for localization in supporting some of those closed loops? So, for example, I know there are projects in France, actually, where they're taking ex-rental skis and using the metal in infrastructure and concrete. So there's and the same on the food side. So where do you see the role of localization in the decarbonisation agenda going forward? Is it the case that it's something that's going to play a really important role, energy, or where do you see that going?
For me, localization is one of the most important things, because this enables us to make small circles, economic circles. And I think the tourism industry, I can talk for Pinska region, for where I'm from. We have two main industries. This is agriculture and this is tourism. And I simply don't understand why those two industries don't work together heart by heart and do something like vertical integration. I don't understand why we don't produce a big part of the foods we are serving to our guests by ourselves. I don't understand why we don't use wood as the most important building material, saving CO2, making better room conditions, and so on and so forth. And so I think localization is one of the most important enablers for changing our behavior, for changing our energy balance. And this comes, and especially energy is a very good example for that, as I mentioned before. But I think localization is the enabler, and very important for me, sustainability means more than something environmental friendly. It means that a decision that is found is balanced in between social aspect, economic aspect, and ecological aspects. And what I see in Rauwes region, that's the town next to me, there would be a possibility to create jobs by producing the food in there and then selling the tomatoes or any vegetable you could imagine to the people who come there. And I think the people are very interested in that. If I want to make a holiday, I want to go somewhere where I learn something, where I don't have a bad mind because I traveled so far with the plane, or I had this and that sauna that used that much energy, and so on and so forth. I think it's very important to give the people a good mood when consuming products and goods and services and so on and so forth. And therefore, circular, small economic circles are very important, because if I come as a visitor, for me, this is something believable, that the people have an identity. If they work together to provide me a nice trip there and provide me good food produced in that area, I believe it to them. This is something, this gives them identity. And I think when the regions start to grow their own identity again, they will start to produce more their own food, their own energy, and so on and so forth. And I'm not against globalization, but I'm wondering very hard why we don't use the possibilities of work in our regions. I hope it's clear what I want to say.
Definitely, and I think that there's a big role for the wider Sustainable Development Goals agenda and this discussion around what the Alpine regions can do. And I think for those of you that are aware that the session at the end of October on the 30th will be specifically tackling the SDGs, because I think that often when people think of sustainability, they automatically think of just the environment. And I think that this particular agenda has shown that there's a huge overlap between the E, the S, and the G in some respects, because we have to engage multiple communities and multiple stakeholders, which has a big impact on the social potential of engaging sustainability as well. And so I think, yeah, there's a really important point you raise about bringing those communities together on the social side. And so just switching over slightly to Markus on some of the innovations on big data, I think are really interesting as well. Just trying to broaden out to see where you think the future is in terms of what the potential is to collaborate on a data perspective. I know when I first started this project, I thought it was crazy that we're not sharing the data on the flow of people on a mountain with the data that's in the snow cannons, that efficiency of resource, and similarly sharing it across multiple different companies that are then operating on the mountain. So what role do you see for big data in particular to improve sustainability of mountain infrastructure? That might even be big data in terms of ecological mapping, and where you put the lakes and how the ecological footprint of a impacts the energy efficiency of a place. So where do you see that discussion going in terms of the future of snowmaking in particular? Markus, are you there? I think we'll just give it a moment.
So now I'm back. Sorry.
Great.
You can hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I was only on mute and
Oh, no problem.
push the button before I start with the speaking.
No problem. Okay, no problem at all.
So big data for us, it's a big challenge. A big challenge means that because we have a lot of data from the mountains. We have a lot of weather data from the mountains. We have a lot of water data in the mountains. We have a lot of energy data from the mountains, and you have to know a little bit. It's not so easy to take in consideration all this data for the snowmaking. Always, because you have to know that we are 100% depending from the nature, because to making snow we need the cold temperatures. For that, we are working together with the universities to make the forecast, to make the weather forecast. We send the data to them, and they send us back the weather forecast located on this point to be more and more precise. And what you have to know a little bit, maybe now we go a little bit in the detail of the snowmaking, what it means snowmaking. It's not only making snow. It means if it's cold, you switch on the gun and then it's working. You have to be very careful, because you have always a factor. You have a translation factor from the water into snow. And this can be in terms of the snow quality. We are speaking always about snow quality, because if you want to ski, you like to ski down on a powder snow, and you don't like to ski down on ice. But and this is exactly the tricky thing for the snowmaking system, you produce always with the same weather condition, or with the different weather conditions, the same snow quality. And for that, we are installing sensors, we are installing wind sensors. If you look some videos, how the snowmaking is working, you see always the plume. You see always that the snow gun, they push out the plume. And as far the plume goes, as better is for the snowmaking, because then the crystals, they have more time in the air to freeze. If the plume goes a little bit behind, or goes a little bit against the snow gun, then the droplets are falling down immediately, and then you have a less performance of the snow gun. For us, it's very important to know how the plume goes, and for this we have to modeling the whole mountain, because there's always microclimates in the mountains. Okay, you cannot say, okay, now I take the climate from, let's say, from the city of Bolzano, and then the whole South Tyrol has the same climate. No, it's not true. Yeah. Each mountain, it's special for them, and you need to calculate for each mountain the microclimate to have the right snowmaking. And for that, I'm sure that in the future, with the big data and you have to analyze how much snow I need for this slope, because you have steeper slope, you have softer slope. You have slopes, you have to cover big stones, and you need a lot of, you can make it, maybe have, you need 20 centimeters of snow, or you need 40 centimeters of snow. And the difference is quite the double of the snow. And in this case, if you have to make the double of the snow, you are using the double of the energy. And there, we have to be careful always, and there we have to make the calculation. And another thing is, we are starting snowmaking always end of October, okay? And then we have to look good in the future, because if I make the snow, it's coming a warm period again, and then it's raining, and then it's melting everything. Then I lost
especially
a
with
lot
climate
of
change. There's
especially
a
when
big
the
range
climate
of that
changing a
now.
little
Yeah.
bit. And for that, I have to be careful. On the beginning, you have always to make the hill, to protect them, and to make as more volume possible with less surface possible. So this is the tricky thing. And for that, we are using the big data to calculate exactly how much snow we are using at which place, and which type of snow gun. Because we have several types of snow gun, a big snow gun, small fog, and you have the lances, several types of lances. And this is not only because we like to develop several snow guns. This is because you have to analyze with the customer together which place, which slope you need, which kind of snow gun to optimize your ski resort, to optimize your snowmaking system. And we are changing the data with the snowcats, because the snowcats, they have the snow height measurement. And then during the winter, then we make the snow where it's needed. Because if everything is white, you don't know how high the snow will be if you have not the snow height measurement. And for that, it's important, because sometimes the snowmaker, they're pushing the buttons, sometimes they are inside in a warm room, they're drinking coffee, and with the computer now, it's not like in the past, you're going out, you have cold, and you have to work by yourself. But now you are more in an office, and so you have to be sure that you are not making too much snow, because it makes no sense to make too much snow. And then in the spring, you have to go there with some black powder, putting on the snow, that the snow will be melted, because the farmer likes to have the cows on the grass. So for that is important. And in the future, what will coming more and more is to integrate the flow of the people on the mountain. Because snow, we're making the snow, and we are not consuming the water, but we are just store the water. But you have always a little bit of, let's say, snow consuming, transferring, because if you have 1,000 people going down to the slope, so they bring always the slope, the snow on the end of the slope. And then you have to remake the snow. And during the winter, you can wait for colder temperatures. It means we have the weather forecast, and then we say, listen, not making snow today, because marginal conditions are important on the first snow making system, that you have marginal conditions, that you have a lot of marginal conditions there, because you need to make the amount of snow. But later on, you can wait, because as colder it is, as more efficient the snow making system will be, because you can more water, because you have more energy in the air that they are taking out to freeze out all the water. That is physically, it's completely clear. But for that, we have the weather forecast, and for that, say to the customer, listen, wait a little bit, in 3 days, in 4 days, in 10 days, there is coming very cold temperatures, and then the snowmaking system will be double as efficient as it is on marginal conditions.
And I think that visibility requires a lot of interconnectivity of different stakeholders, I would say.
Yeah.
And I know we're going to segue really nicely into Constance, actually, because I know that in the work that you're doing on energy efficiency in particular, it requires this real collaboration of different skill sets across organizations. And I know that you were at an event this week with many different organizations, from Michelin to Engie to BNP and others. So what role do you think energy efficiency is going to have in this journey going forward in terms of decarbonisation of the Alps? And in particular, where do you see coalitions and this shared knowledge and how it's going to influence the agenda?
So first, I think today energy efficiency it's a major topic which is not well tackled. 50% of the energy we produce is wasted, and that's why energy efficiency is basically a major stake when it comes to reducing GHG emissions. It accounts for actually 40% of the required reduction in GHG to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement by 2050. But beyond this, for me, energy efficiency also brings major benefits, and in particular, energy efficiency generates short-term savings. I was telling you today, everyone is low in cash. So energy efficiency is a perfect solution and the perfect match between environmental targets and financial sustainability. So for me, the good thing with energy efficiency is that it's small project, doesn't require massive investments, and usually you get, if you implement it well, something like 10 to 15% cost reduction on your energy invoice with a payback time of less than 18 months. So I do believe it's something which is easy to implement everywhere in the mountain. And for me, it's important to tackle it fast at all levels, from the ski resorts to the companies operating in mountain, but also to all the individual owners of chalets, flats. There's still so many flats that still have a basic window and not double windows. So we need more efficient machines. We need more efficient lifts, LED lights, and above all, more efficient buildings. So we need to renovate the buildings to avoid unnecessary heating. And for this, many actors have a role to play. And I think with the EU Green Deal, with what's happening in each country, there's lots of incentives for people to do this. So you have the incentives, you have the actors with the know-how. In France, it's the NGs who are extremely good and have the right data to be able to provide solutions. But it's also a matter of renunciation. You know, I've been skiing in almost European ski resorts to compete. I used to love my Doppelmayr heated chair lift in Austria. Today, I think I'd rather have a chair which is not heated, just because we cannot afford to spend so much on energy, and we need to be able to renunciate to some elements to be able to perform energy efficiency.
That's really interesting, actually, because I think you bring in this role of the levers that different organizations have to play, and in particular the policy and the corporate and the finance drivers. And I think it's a really good time to kind of flip to Nikolai, because I think his work at ICLEI has been really interesting in terms of addressing some of those levers. So Nikolai, what do you see as some of the levers that are necessary to change over the coming, I say year, but it feels like it's now because we're in the middle of a climate crisis, in terms of your role and where you see? I know that across this panel we've mentioned numerous of those, but in your work at ICLEI, where are you seeing that agenda going in terms of the levers that are required? And just a reminder that everybody should submit questions via the chat, and we'll be collecting those in around 5 minutes to present to the speakers.
Yes, thank you, Sarisha. I think that maybe to start that answer off is by looking at what an understanding of circularity at the local level is, and I think the definitions and from a research perspective really diverge quite a bit from understanding circular economy quite from an economic perspective, all the way up to completely rethinking our economic system and stopping to consume. You know, this is basically the portfolio you have there, and we at ICLEI we understand this concept in 4 pillars basically, and although we don't have an answer for it or a very precise definition, we know that the circular economy for the local level needs to center around integrating I could elaborate on that, but I won't. Into all the functions that the city is performing. Yeah, in all the functions, it is about generating value, both monetary but also utility. So maintaining the utility, the function of goods and services. It's about closing loops. I think we all know what that is, but it is also about the impact. I think that is even more crucial. So the impact needs to be human well-being. It needs to be on the environment. It needs to maintain our living standard somehow. So that hints also to some kind of economic prosperity that we need to have without consuming more. And what cities can do to achieve that centers around, or could center around five big levers, let's say. One of them is around strategy development and vision development. Another one is about engagement. You talked about it before. So the cities or an territory has the ability, based on a strategy, to engage businesses, research institutions, and so on, and be sort of a platform for dialogue. And I think cities or governments can do that. But also there's asset management and the way local governments manage all the buildings they have, manage their infrastructure assets and so on, and integrating circularity there is key. Public procurement would also belong under this pillar. And of course, cities can also set to some degree economic incentives, regulation and so on. And with the economic incentive, I think a very big push that we need, I'm not sure that local governments can provide that, but a big push we need is really to internalize the external costs of products and services that are there to sort of increase the price of the bad stuff, let's say the bad goods, and make the more sustainable goods cheaper. And I think that would tremendously help the circular economy to thrive at all kinds of levels.
That's really interesting about the externalization of costs, because I think you bring up a point about how there really needs to be visibility on some of those impacts as well in doing so. I see that we have a couple of questions coming in as well. So I'm just going to try and collate some of those. Please do submit your questions via the chat function. And I'm going to ask the panelists now. So if we just go to I mean, there's quite a few quite long questions, but I'm going to summarize one of the points because I think it's quite interesting. And this question is in particular for Constance. So Pamela wants to know that she's got quite an interesting question around ESG measurement, and in reality how useful, I guess, some of those scorings are, and whether it's actually tangible for some of the investments that are required. I wondered what you think of that, especially in light of some of the science-based targets developments that are going on across the industry.
So I think it's a very relevant question. It used to be that ESG data were not standardized and often used by some financial actors as, I would say, a pretext, something very anecdotal to look good. Honestly, I think we're way past this today. So indeed, you're referring to certain ETFs, probably certain ETFs that are marginally divesting from the worst actors and marginally investing more on other companies. I think for me, the way I see it, sustainable finance today is a lot more than this. I can tell you that I've been in intense discussions with large corporates for the past 3 years on what are their objectives. There's two questions for me each time we do a sustainable finance financing. One is, are we talking about the right indicator? So typically, if a company whose biggest issue is carbon emission, if they're coming with an objective of diversification of their workforce, that's not where the market is expecting them. So yes, it's good. I'm not going to tell them you shouldn't be more diverse, but really what we want to hear and what investors want to hear is they're going to reduce their carbon emission. If a company comes with an objective of reduce deforestation, it's never enough. It has to be zero deforestation at an horizon, which is a short-term horizon. So there's two big challenges that we're giving to companies today. It's what is the right indicator and what is the right level, and a level which is ambitious enough of your indicator. And to be quite honest, today, we've even created a job which is to bring to those companies the vision of investors so that they're ambitious enough and they're on the right topic and objectives. So we're really doing everything it takes to have the right data and also to be on the topics that are the most material by sector. So I hear your concern, but I would say this was a concern 5 years ago. It may be a practice which still is occurring, I would say, let's say in the US, but what I can tell you is in Europe, all the European banks who are involved in sustainable finance are way past this.
And I think that materiality point's really interesting because it goes to the part of saying when you break down a supply chain of infrastructure, where is that embedded carbon as well to be able to tackle it? And I guess, Nikolai, this could be quite an interesting question for you in regards with that. Just a reminder, please do submit questions via the chat function and we'll be fielding those. So where there are some really large CO2 emission sectors, so for example, looking at embedded carbon in concrete, steel, aluminium, how does the recent policy development tackle some of those? So is it the case that in the framework that's developed for circular cities that there's a way to address that embedded carbon, or where do you see the role of looking at the component parts, I guess, of some of that infrastructure to decarbonize it?
Well, I think mainly speak about the European level on this point. I mean, we have recently seen the introduction of the European Circular Action Plan that involves a number of high carbon sectors. Not only relevant to cities, obviously, but across the board, and that includes buildings. We have the so-called renovation wave. That is really a specialized kind of program targeted at increasing the energy refurbishment of buildings across Europe, but also looking at the whole life cycle, and that means also looking at the embodied energy and footprints of buildings. That is taking off. At the same time, we have the bioeconomy strategy and agenda that is being set, and of course a number of initiatives and programs such as the New Horizon Europe and now the Green Deal that tries to sort of make available funding to flank these policy actions and to actually lead to implementation. And there's a number of initiatives being launched now, such as the Circular Cities and Regions initiative, supposed to support research and development on exactly that point that you mentioned.
That's interesting, because it then requires a real synergy of expertise across the different industries. Just so you guys are aware, I think it's interesting what Barbara Bauer, and she's from the IBO, which is a real leader in looking at sustainable buildings in Austria, has posted quite an interesting link there to some of the frameworks going on in Austria, just so that you can see that there. And also the EU Circular Economy Action Plan. And for those of you that missed the session on Sati at the end of September, have a look on our social media, because we've got a link to that session where the woman who led that stakeholder action group at the EU, Lydia Kozir, presented and talked quite a lot at length about that action plan. So that could be quite interesting for those of you that are looking at that space. There's quite an interesting question here coming from Dominic Winter, and I guess, Alois, this might be for you, around how can local businesses and individuals effectively motivate operations across the resort in terms of moving towards net zero, and typically looking at, especially transport, is quite a large fraction of the emissions. I know that in the previous Sati session we did in September, we talked about how some regions were looking at decarbonisation of transport, but where do you see the role of local leaders in this dialogue?
I see the role in creating new business models. I think it's very important that we start to think about new business models, small business models, that at one side contribute to fight against climate change, and on the other side create small circular economies, as mentioned before. And I think it's very important to start to look at the potential every individual in our society in a specific region is having. Everybody is having other background, everybody is having different ideas, and I think in those thousands of backgrounds and thousands of ideas, there's a huge potential that could be lifted. Of course, therefore, we would need an infrastructure that incubates those kinds of new ideas and new businesses. And therefore, I think it's very important to do something like we are doing here right now, to talk, to discuss, to listen to other people's ideas and other people's problems and so on and so forth. And I think especially in the ski resorts area, we have to take the business owners out of their comfort zone. They simply not start to think about the energy costs as long as the costs are calculated within the price of the room. But at the moment where they have to think more about the cost for energy or for any other stuff regarding that sustainable things we're talking about, I think then they will start to think about new modules, new roles, new options, new possibilities. And this would be very important. As I see it in my surrounding, more and more people start their own self-run businesses, very small businesses, and do small services, easy services, and all relate to fight climate change, because of course it's trendy. You don't do something that is dirty and pollutes the air. That's not interesting for a big amount of people. They want something renewable. And what I mean is, we should believe and see the potential the people in the specific regions are having. We have to talk with them. We have to say to them, try it. Just try it. There's nothing that could happen.
I guess there's a big role for kind of solidarity in that process then, and encouraging a real intergenerational dialogue. I know that my own thesis had found that actually that was a huge potential for driving change, especially in the hotels and building sector, because there was a lot of intergenerational learning potential in terms of both the history of those businesses, but also looking forward to embracing new technologies. I guess we've got time for one more question before we move to introduce our facilitators and the breakout rooms. So I guess this one, I'm thinking it's quite an interesting one for Constance potentially, in terms of the standards around energy efficiency of buildings. So we've got a question around why are hoteliers and financiers and the cities as well, so I guess Nikolai, feel free to chip in, not asking for good standards on energy efficiency in buildings. I think that's quite interesting, because I would say there's a spectrum of that level of integrity of standards. But I guess, Constance, what's your thoughts on that?
I think it's like all policy making. You start being positive, trying to bring incentives to people to do energy efficiency and renovation. And then after a certain point, if people don't do it, the only way is to bring some negative taxation for people not doing it. So personally, I do believe the public sector has a role to play nowadays. I think this year is, and probably next year, is still going to be a year of positive incentives, but we cannot afford to wait too long to start bringing taxation for people who have not implemented basic stuff, such as double layered windows.
That's really interesting. I guess, Nikolai, do you have anything to add on that front in terms of the standard side, and maybe even the implication of those, as Constance alluded to?
I just have a small addition to that. I'm not sure that that I understand the question for this building part, because we do have standards for buildings in anywhere. It doesn't matter whether it's a city or where, but I think these are largely national sort of well, it's a national task to formulate those, because it concerns legislation. Have such standards. You cannot build a building now that has energy efficiency standards from 50 years ago. You're not allowed to do that anymore. But maybe what Barbara Bauer is referring to is also the energy refurbishment, to also look at more restrictive plans, strategies, funding, etc., for really accelerating this refurbishment rate of the building stock that exists, that doesn't have these high standards. And I think that is crucial.
And I think that progressive kind of vision of standards, and where we need to really set a benchmark for sustainability being integrated is something that we're seeing across multiple industries now. And some of the sessions that we've got later on across the months will be addressing that as well in different sectors. So I'm just going to introduce our facilitators for the breakout room. So the way that will work is that we essentially move from this panel into smaller groups where we'll be discussing 3 particular themes. I'm just going to stop my screen sharing for one moment so that I can get my colleague to set up the breakout rooms. Bear with me one moment. Sorry for this slight technical delay. Give me a second. Okay, whilst I do that, I'm going to get Marc and Kelly to introduce themselves. So Marc is fantastic, and he's one of the colleagues of mine on the Cambridge course, but also a real leader in looking at sustainability and infrastructure. And we've got Kelly Coombes, who's also a climate risk expert, and will be facilitating one of the breakout rooms as well. I guess, Marc, do you want to introduce yourself while I set up these breakout rooms with Dan?
Hi, well, thank you for that introduction. I am Marc Tkach. My background is I'm a civil engineer. Now I do a lot of design and construction programs across the world, mainly in the developing world. I'm really interested in this program because there's a lot to be learned and shared across sectors, and how how energy efficiency, how circularity is incorporated, how sustainability is incorporated in our work. So thank you. Glad to be here.
And Kelly?
Hi everyone, though it just says K on my thing, I'm actually Kelly Coombes. I work with insurance market in the UK to be able to get them to become more transparent about their climate risk.
Great. And I guess I'm just going to get Marc to go through what we'll be going through in the breakout sessions while I just set those up.
All right, so we're going to be addressing 4 questions. We'll do a quick icebreaker. We'll ask everyone to talk about what's motivating you to join today. And then 3 following questions. So they are, what is the missing link in scaling up renewable energy implementation in the Alpine industry? Second question is, how can we improve harnessing circular economy in infrastructure? And then lastly, what role do you think finance has to play in accelerating climate action within the industries you are in? So very interested to hear people's perspectives, but also case studies and examples of what they've seen work and where.
So we're just going to end with a quick reflection with Kelly and Marc as well, in terms of what you found quite interesting from your group, and any feedback you can share about what the thoughts were on some of those levers that were discussed. I guess, Kelly, do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Sure, we had a really interesting session. So I guess there was a theme that was running through the 3 questions, and one was transparency, the next one was accessibility, as well as starting with the intention to be climate related or to be environmentally based. So one was you kind of got to promote what it is that you're doing. You've got to be transparent about what it is that you're doing to kind of galvanize and get people to have the effort. But as well, if you start a project, you've always got to start with a project for it to be circular or for it to be green or anything like that. Otherwise, you're never going to get there in the end. If you try and build it in later, it's not going to work. And I think that if we're kind of short on time, so those were our main 3 takeaways. That's
interesting. So it's really got to be baked in, I guess, from the DNA of the company, and whether it's looking at a project at post-production as well. I think it's really interesting because so much of that infrastructure that exists is legacy infrastructure as well. So I guess in that retrofit process, embedding sustainability is going to be quite critical in that. So that's really useful for everyone to hear about. And I guess, Marc, what were the key thoughts on yours? And I'm sorry if there was any tech issues from our side on setting up the breakout rooms. Hopefully everybody was able to join a breakout room and to discuss with the rest of the group.
Well, hi, I just wanted to pick on a couple of points that we discussed. We had a great group and a great conversation, but one was a question that Pamela asked is, are these investments, do they actually have the return? Are they worth making? into renewable energy, for example. And we had Fabrice on, I hope I got this right, but as we look at trends in the industry moving towards subscription models for lift tickets, for example, and making more regular cash flows, but also thinking about what that could do for the summer season as well, and and how we make this more of a year-round experience. So it's not only a winter experience, but the subscription helps these companies that have much more irregular seasons. So it's very interesting.
That's interesting, because sorry, I'm just going to mute. I think, and I can hear some background noise from somebody. I'll just mute them now. Bear with me a second. That's really interesting. So there's a big role for looking at new sustainable business models that also seem to embrace technology, I guess, as well, because moving towards that subscription model for ski tickets is super interesting. I mean, I know I'm a season holder, and I think if I look at generally the idea of subscription models, I think it's really interesting to see how you can look at utilization of an asset over the period that you would use it, whether it's skis that have a rental market. But there's big ways to extend that notion of leasing to multiple industries, and in infrastructure in particular, a lot of that new technology that's required to decarbonize, whether it's a factory or whether it's waste management system, could be better improved through leasing, because then you get access to a much more efficient technology. So I think that concept's super interesting. Just to finish off on the group that we had, so there were some really interesting points raised, and I think it was similar to Marc and to Kelly in the sense that we talked about points-based systems and the role that they play in incentivizing mechanisms. We talked about the localization and why communities are important to empower that model. So for example, when you have energy at a local level, what are the incentives to give back to the grid, and essentially to have community solar versus kind of individual is really interesting. There was also a discussion of a carbon tax, which is always quite an interesting, controversial one that was brought up, and quite a lot of debate around that, and what were the levers there. And finally, I think this really ties to our work at Cambridge as well, Marc, I guess, on and Kelly in your role as a climate risk consultant, in how do you actually incentivize different behavior change? I think it really boils down to the point of levers and incentivizing behavior change. I think that might be through financial mechanisms, but it also might be through education and awareness. And Dominic from Protect Our Winters was talking about that in terms of an information gap, and why that's really important to correct in a way. So just looking ahead to the final sessions coming up for October. So just for those of you that are still on the call, so SATI is obviously a series as we've set it up, but the next session will be on the 30th of October at 12 Central European time, and we'll be discussing that wider Sustainable Development Goals agenda. I know that quite a few of you had been part of that discussion in the past, and I encourage you all to register for that, because that will be at the end of October. And I just want to give a huge thank you to all of our panelists as well, and especially to Marc and to Kelly for really supporting this whole project from the start. And I'm sorry that we can't meet in person in Austria, but I'm sure that we'll definitely catch up again soon. And thank you so much for sharing your insights and your expertise as well. And I think it's great to have this collaborative dialogue with all of you that have joined. And yes, please do share your thoughts on this on social media. As I said, #SATIdigital. Do feel free to get in contact with me or any of the speakers if you'd like any more information. And yes, just very big thank you, and thank you to the events team as well. No, Dan has been hard at work helping me set up today's session, so I really appreciate that as well. Thank you so much, everyone.